Thank you, Chairman. Earlier this year, the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis found that the Treasury Department privately encouraged lenders to prioritize existing customers when issuing Paycheck Protection Program loans, leaving many minority-owned small businesses without access to important federal aid. So, Comptroller Brooks and Chair McWilliams, were you aware that Treasury privately encouraged banks to focus on their PPP lending to existing customers? And a simple yes or no would do.
So Senator Menendez, thank you for that question. I was not aware that there was such a thing, and I'm not aware today. I do know that there were some issues around BSA/AML compliance, which did lead some banks to make those judgments themselves because they had already vetted their existing customers. But I'm not aware of what you suggest just now.
Likewise, Senator Menendez, I was not aware, but I know that initially banks we were asking them to originate these loans quickly to get them to the economy so that people can get paid and make their payments. And as a result of that, reaching out to existing customers alleviated some of the burdens.
Okay, so you said you didn't know, neither of you knew, but the head of the American Banking Association told its board of directors, quote, Treasury would like for banks to go to their existing customer base. And J.P. Morgan corroborated this account, explaining, quote, from early on, there was an understanding from Treasury that banks would be working with existing clients. So you must have known that at least this was unofficial guidance. And did you push back in that regard?
So Senator Menendez, maybe I can start with an answer to that. So early on in the PPP rollout, one of the things that we identified across our banks was not that they were favoring their existing customers, it was that they were having a hard time doing KYC, as I say, another compliance for new clients in the door in a rapid response framework. So one of the things we did at the OCC is we convened a set of listening sessions with banks that were having that difficulty and fintechs that had adopted various know your customer and customer identity verification tools to allow them to quickly originate loans to people that weren't already in their systems. We know anecdotally that listening session had some results, that there were some partnerships that resulted in that, and particularly in the mid-size and community bank group inside of the OCC, they were able to ramp up new customer support.
And Senator Menendez, from the FDIC, community banks were proactively reaching to their customers, and to the extent that they had new inquiries from new customers, they had to go to the due diligence that, frankly, the agencies would require them.
Did either you or the FDIC or the OCC encourage banks to extend PPP lending beyond their customer base?
So, Senator, speaking for the OCC, absolutely. That was the purpose of those listening sessions that I mentioned before. Those were attended by.
But beyond listening, did you urge them to extend beyond their customer base?
Yeah, the whole announced point of the listening sessions was to help them overcome the hurdles to get to new customers. That was
I would just simply say many minority-owned small businesses do not have existing banking relationships. And Treasury's decision to encourage banks to prioritize PPP loans to their existing customers, and from my perspective, both the FDIC and OCC's inactions has had devastating consequences on our nation's minority-owned small businesses. Limiting PPP loans to banking customers left minority small businesses out of $670 billion of federal aid. Now 41% of Black-owned small businesses, 32% of Latino-owned small businesses are permanently closed because of the pandemic. This was avoidable. It's avoidable, and it's a shame that's in fact what took place. Let me ask you, Comptroller Brooks, in May I asked former Comptroller Oding about your agency's work on the Community Reinvestment Act. At the time, Mr. Oding stated that despite the pandemic and evidence that the PPP lending was failing to serve minority communities, the OCC should accelerate its work on implementing the CRA rule, a rule that most in the civil rights community opposed. Since then, the Federal Reserve issued its own advance notice of proposed rulemaking that invites comments from stakeholders on how the CRA can be strengthened to better meet its core purposes of reinvesting in low-income communities. When the Fed issued this ANPR, you stated, quote, I've told the Fed that they get good comments in response to their rulemaking. We're not beyond the prospect of finding ways of improving it even more. But can you clarify what exactly you meant by that? it seems to me that the Fed is likely going to receive comments from the civil rights community and other largely comments that track what they stated in response to your rulemaking. The OCC disregarded a lot of that at the time. What would lead you to change your mind now?
Well, Senator Menendez, the first thing I guess I would say is that the Fed's ANPR is so similar to the OCC's final rule in its substantive elements as to be almost indistinguishable in terms of their change in geographic assessment areas, their inclusion of Native American country, small family farms, and other things that were originated in the OCC's rule. We frankly took it as imitation being the sincerest form of flattery when it came to their ANPR. The main difference between the Fed's ANPR and the OCC's rule is that the Fed appears to continue to prefer subjective and discretionary performance assessments, whereas our view is these things should be more objective and predictable over time. But what I really meant was I think both the Fed and the OCC recognize that the status quo is simply untenable. The status quo had been tied to bank branches as the only areas incentivized for lending and investment, and banks have pulled more than 10,000 branches out of poor and minority communities over the last 25 years. So our basic view was we need to make the system better. And if there's a way of making it still better next year, we're happy to do that. But letting it sit for another 2 years in the current status quo was, in our view, an unacceptable option.
I think it's always telling that the entire civil rights community has a much different point of view. And if anyone's an advocate for these people, it's them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.